When people open the New Testament and read the letters attributed to Paul, most assume he wrote all of them. But for several hundred years, scholars have been asking two big questions. Which letters did Paul actually write, and did he write Hebrews? You know, I actually receive a lot of questions about whether Paul wrote or was involved in the writing of Hebrews. So I'm going to share my thoughts about that in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at the 13 letters traditionally attributed to Paul in the New Testament. Now, it does come as a surprise to many Bible readers that scholars debate which of these 13 letters Paul actually wrote. So within this set of 13 letters, scholars speak of two general categories regarding Pauline authorship. So one category is the 7 undisputed Pauline letters, and the other category is the 6 disputed Pauline letters. Now, before I even share which letters fall into which category, which I'm sure you're already thinking about, I want to be absolutely clear. Disputed does not mean a letter is bad, fake, or unreliable. When we say that a Pauline letter is disputed, it simply means that its authorship is debated. It does not automatically mean Paul didn't write it, or that it shouldn't be included in the New Testament, or that it carries less spiritual authority for Christians. All right, so which letters are undisputed and which are disputed? Let's take a look. So, most scholars agree that the 7 undisputed letters written by Paul are these: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. So with these 7 letters, there's a consensus that Paul's voice is consistent in his language, his tone, theology, and general historical circumstances. All right, well, then we have the 6 disputed letters. And again, disputed doesn't mean rejected. It means that there are 6 letters attributed to Paul that scholars debate or dispute whether Paul actually wrote them. Now, within this group of 6 disputed letters, scholars often divide them into 2 groups of 3. So the first group, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, these are less disputed. So plenty of scholars question whether Paul penned these letters personally, but plenty of others think Paul did write these letters because Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians sit close to Paul's world and show strong continuity with his thought, even if the writing style or themes differ slightly. Now, the second disputed group is frequently referred to as the pastoral epistles. So we're talking about 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And among the disputed letters, these 3 are the most disputed. So why are these 3 so disputed? Well, many look to the vocabulary, church structures, and overall tone of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and see some significant differences with the undisputed letters. So many scholars conclude that these 3 were written after Paul's lifetime, possibly by a close coworker or student seeking to preserve and apply Paul's legacy to new situations. Now, that said, I do want to note that at the recent Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting, I heard an excellent presentation that argued for reconsidering 2 Timothy as an undisputed letter. And I also learned that there are more scholars who are persuaded that Paul wrote 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus than I actually realized. But again, the pastoral epistles, along with Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, remain disputed regarding Pauline authorship, despite plenty of advocates that argue for their authenticity. Now, what about Hebrews? Well, despite the King James Bible placing Hebrews after Paul's letters, and despite some early traditions associating Hebrews with Paul, virtually all scholars today agree that Paul did not write Hebrews. So the Greek in Hebrews is far more polished than what we typically see in Paul's letters, and the structure is different. The way Hebrews quotes scripture doesn't match Paul's patterns, and the early church itself was unsure who wrote Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is a beautiful, brilliant, theologically rich work, but it's unlikely that Paul wrote it. So who did write Hebrews? Well, I've heard a lot of theories. I bet you have too, and the Ideas I've heard range from Stephen to Barnabas to Priscilla to Apollos and even Luke. But personally, I agree with the 3rd century church father Origen, who famously said of Hebrews, "But who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows." In other words, Hebrews is a powerful and deeply valuable letter, but its human author remains unknown. Now let's turn back to Paul's letters for a moment, because there's a key factor regarding authorship that I haven't mentioned yet that I want to mention quickly. So even when it comes to the undisputed letters of Paul, Paul didn't always pen his letters with his own hand. He often used a scribe, or what some have called a secretary. So in Paul's case, it appears that sometimes he dictated his letters word for word. Other times, it's likely that the scribe crafted his wording. So this helps explain Paul's stylistic variation even within his undisputed letters. Actually, it's pretty interesting that in Romans chapter 16, verse 22, Paul's scribe actually inserts himself into the letter when he writes, "I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord." And Paul's use of a scribe explains lines like the one at the end of Galatians where he says, "Look at what large letters I write with my own hand." So that was probably Paul's way of putting his personal signature on a letter otherwise written by a scribe. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, it matters because highlighting which letters Paul likely wrote is a reminder of something essential. The letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament were, in fact, letters. Now, because Christians canonized Paul's letters as scripture, it's easy to assume that Paul was sitting down to write systematic theological treatises for the church in every generation. But that wasn't Paul's intention. Paul was writing real letters to real people facing real and often very complex circumstances. The Pauline letters arose out of pastoral concerns. They were written to solve real problems, offer encouragement, correct misunderstandings, strengthen relationships, and guide diverse communities that Paul knew personally, visited, or hoped to visit. So it invites us to approach these texts with fresh eyes, and it pushes us to ask questions such as, what situation was this letter addressing? What questions or challenges were the recipients facing? Why did Paul choose this tone, this argument, or this pastoral approach? So as we seek to understand Paul's voice in our own modern context, it's important that we do the work of understanding the circumstances and factors shaping each individual letter that bears Paul's name, whether it's disputed, undisputed, or somewhere in between. And doing this work pays off. It enriches spiritual formation for those who read Paul devotionally, and it deepens insight for those who study him as one of history's most influential Jewish figures. Ultimately, reading Paul as a letter writer, a Jewish apostle responding to real human situations, helps us hear him more clearly and appreciate the living, dynamic nature of these ancient texts so that we can better understand them in our time. Hey, if you'd like to learn more about Paul and his Jewish and Greco-Roman context, check out my book, The Weird Apostle. You can find it on Amazon, and don't miss out on any of my new content by subscribing wherever you're watching or listening. And if you'd like to learn more about how to build bridges between Jews and Christians, check out bridgebuildersforum.com.